A day with DMT. I had been waiting to try DMT for a long time. Got some fumarate, waited a few months till my mood settled. My assistant Brian accompanied me throughout the day of testing. We started out by weighing 3 separate amounts of about 100 milligrams and then made individual 50 milligram amounts. We traded off between hits, occasionally bumping our doses with hits of 10 to 30 milligrams. There was definitely some eyeballing that went on. We put the doses into gelatin capsules for holding. After the third go for each of us, we stopped counting the milligrams. 1:30 p.m., the first doses. I weighed out 25 milligrams out of one of the 50 milligram capsules for Brian since he wanted to start and let me watch him before I started. I dumped the DMT on top of a half-packed bowl of weed, and before I could top it off with more weed, Brian hit it. Brian took 2 large hits, holding them in for about 5 seconds each. Brian remarked at how it tasted and smelled like plastic. I agreed. Brian's pupils dilated very quickly. Within the span of 20 seconds, Brian laid back on the couch and closed his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but closed it. I asked Brian how it was. He had a positive response. I weighed out 25 milligrams, sandwiched it between weed, took 3 hits, and waited. In around 10 seconds, it had hit me, like an electric shock straight into my brain. A wave of heat rippled from my chest to the top of my head, then spread down my body, locking me in place. I felt incredible, alive. Everything was brighter. The room felt so spacious. I had never noticed how the sun peeked through the blinds like that, or how my walls were covered in faces. In a similar manner of LSD, magnification of the point that you stare in seems to elicit flashing geometric webs of scenes and people in peripheral vision. My body felt lit up and magnificent. Brian looked at me and grinned. He asked me to try to work the visualizer on the TV, so I put a psychedelic visualizer up on the Chromecast. There will be a link in the description below for that. It became an important focal point for both Brian and my experiences. 2 p.m., second rounds. After having been pleased with 25 milligrams, we both agreed that it felt startlingly like LSD, but Brian experienced different effects than I did. Where my geometry was largely external, Brian's remained nearly exclusively internal. While Brian reported, "This is really trippy, dude," he explained that his visual field was mostly distorted and was not how I was describing my effects. Brian also came up for an entire 10 minutes before he reported intense effects like I experienced. Having this in mind, I believe it is safe to say that personal neurochemistry is heavily dependent on the experience of this psychedelic and likely all psychedelics. This aside, we decided to go higher. Knowing that 50 milligrams would not be simply twice as intense as 25 milligrams, we decided to jump there. I'm assuming these doses were 50 milligrams. They were more likely between 47 milligrams and 57 milligrams. I don't have exacts for these since we were pretty inebriated and were acting somewhat brashly. Brian went first again, but he let me properly sandwich the DMT this time. He took 1 hit and it was too much. After a glass of water and a few minutes, he told me to finish the bowl. The bowl looked mostly cleared. I pulled the stale smoke, breathed out with the bowl, and killed it. As soon as the smoke hit my throat, I knew something was weird. It tasted like my last DMT hit, but far more intense. It became very clear to me pretty immediately that I had taken the majority of his hit, as well as probably some residue. It hit me so hard. That sensation I explained before, but with the force of 1,000 suns. My body didn't have weight anymore. Everything was going in slow motion. Brian moved, looked at me, and said that I should come sit on the couch and see how the visualizer on the TV looked reflected on the green marble slab I had on my coffee table. We colloquially referred it to the Coke slab. I got up, walked to my couch for 7 years, sat down, and stared at the center of the visualizer. In the End by Drew Hill blared out from my speakers. The deep resonating bass and fast-paced nature began to dictate the speed and emotion of the geometry. As I stared at the center of the TV, the edges of the TV began to expand in stop motion like 4 frames a second. Keeping my gaze made it more intense. The TV expanded to begin devouring my entire visual field. My table, with my yellow bong, green blowtorch, and other little things, grew and fell into millions of different states of matter. It was a desert with a deep red setting sun, a civilization of fire, cities rising and crumbling to the ground. The table picked up and drifted around my vision. I felt my body being crumpled into a ball like a piece of paper. It felt incredible and terrifying, and I was being pulled into the TV. The music surged through my veins. I was completely unable to move. The TV's visualizer had now engulfed my entire visual field. I was inside of it, in this world of TV. The music still carrying me further and further into a plane of complete insanity. Then, just as soon as this incredibly, ridiculously, visually intense alteration had come, it was gone, fading away. I moved my head, objects sweeping back into place. I sat for a second, completely blown away what had just happened. How long had it been? I felt so incredibly amazing. Waves and waves of soaring warmth surged up and down my body. I stood up. "Wow!" I shouted. Brian opened his eyes, confused. I raved and ranted about what had just happened. It was incredible, more intense than what 35 milligrams of 2CP had given me. That was the most ridiculous shit ever. I sat down. Brian was surprised at my sudden reaction. He was still peeking, and it was all internal for him. He asked me for a bump, saying that I feel like I'm about to make contact with the outside, but I'm not there yet. I picked up another 50 milligram capsule and tapped about a third of it into the bowl, added weed, he hit it. Brian experienced much more difficulty with the taste and harshness of the smoke than I did. He laid back and asked me to turn on more music. So I put on Odeza's In Return album. I dumped another 1/3 of the 50 milligrams into the bowl, covered it in weed, hit it, and let the rippling take me again. The visuals weren't as intense this time. I didn't kill all the DMT in the bowl most likely. The stop motion flashing geometry forming around the center of my vision was still there. The walls breathed in and out, rippling like scales on the wind, shimmering with a breeze that wasn't there. The music took my body with it and flung me around the room, sending me startlingly powerful waves of tingling sensations, as deliberating as 2CP, but without the fear or discomfort. It felt incredibly positive, lovingly hot and sharp, like I was being lifted out of the earth and into the sky. I got up, danced around, feeling my body move in slow motion. I had incredible control. I was not mentally foggy. I could think completely clearly, but the idea of transforming internally developed concepts into language was an impossible task. For the duration of the peak, I momentarily did not feel as though I was a person with an identity, but an entity that was simply moving in tune with forces beyond my natural ability to control. I danced around and we kept taking probably 10 to 20 milligram bumps for a while longer before we took a 10-minute break and decided to take 60 plus. 4:30 p.m. Last rounds and walked to the park. I loaded in 60 milligrams for Brian. It took him a number of hits and a little extra weed to get through it all. He said that he came up for a much longer time than I did. I loaded around 50 milligrams into my bowl, cleared the bowl, and sat back to wait. At this point, Taiko was playing. I was able to move. When I closed my eyes, I would see a thin film over what looked like a barely protruding dimension. It was a scene of people sitting around eating and drinking at tables, with what I imagined to be the sun out. It looked weird, like muddy and brown. It was as if there was a layer of water between me and the scene, and the surface was barely being breached by the edges of the scene, like it was just partially formed. Very strange. I walked over and made a PB&J sandwich. Eating it was profoundly intense. Moving my muscles was easy, but the taste was beyond what I understood the taste of a peanut butter and jelly. So many layers of flavors, so interesting. I made some tea. It was incredible how lucid I was. While experiencing deafening and all-encompassing visual geometry, I was able to move and use my hands normally. While being a little wafty and dance-like in my movements, I was mostly able to complete everyday tasks. I closed my eyes and saw a different scene of rapidly changing animal faces and explosions of matter. Breaking my silence, Brian remarked that he could see spacescapes and that he felt as though he were being lifted into space. I asked him if he wanted to go outside. He said yes, but that I needed to give him a bit. I started coming down, smoked a bowl, bumped another small eyeball dose of DMT, put on my shoes, and we went outside. In the park, what flowers were blooming looked incredibly intricate, and my vision kept zooming in on certain aspects of textures. Colors were somewhat saturated, and my skin was very sensitive to the breeze outside. It felt abnormally cold. The cars looked very strange. When I stared at them, they would start expanding over my vision like the TV did before. So I tried not to stare at one thing for too long. Unfortunately, immediately after this, I looked down the street ahead of me. And while walking, my body felt as though it had been hooked and then violently tugged across the street while it stretched into infinity. I kept walking normally, keeping it together. Brian was behind me and walking slower, smoking his cigarette. While in the park, we didn't talk much except about the effects that we were experiencing. Eventually, we went back as the effects started to subside. By 6 p.m., we were both mostly down. Brian left and I was left to watch House of Cards. I smoked a bowl and it seems to me that my tolerance for weed had been reset. It hit me really hard and my walls were breathing and tingling with geometric shapes. 10 a.m., 37 milligram shower the next day. I woke up the next day feeling tired but emotionally refreshed and put the remaining 37 milligrams of DMT as weighed into a bowl with weed. I smoked it, undressed, and got in the shower. While I was in the shower, it hit me. Again, my walls felt very spacious. They looked to be expanding outward. As I got further and further into it, my body felt lighter, the water on my skin feeling more like amorphous heat being generated onto my skin. The tiles in my shower whirred and expanded into more of themselves, like they duplicated over the texture. With the increasingly extra lines, the squares began to shift into faces, large dragons, ogres, random anthropomorphic beings that rapidly shifted from one to another. I danced in my shower until I felt the effects decreasing, stepped out, and got ready for the day. DMT is a very interesting chemical, and it isn't really what I expected it would be. When smoked at doses under 60 milligrams, it seems to be very external, with geometry alternating between 8A and 8B visual override effects. Brian experienced the chemical in a very different manner than I had. For Brian, it was entirely internal, and the timeline was much longer than it was for me. My visuals remained nearly entirely external, with a couple breakthroughs. At 66 milligrams, I experienced a full and immersive breakthrough the day before. I will consider smoking as much as 100 milligrams, but I think it would be much better to try DMT with an MAOI and oral ROA.